Hi there, and thanks for joining us for Mastering the Next Generation Science Standards. My name's Francis Vigent. My role here at KnowAtom is as CEO. And to give you a little sense of what KnowAtom is and what we do, we're an organization made up of folks who are former teachers who bring our passion for teaching, particularly for transforming students' higher order thinking skills, their creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills to science and engineering education, particularly around the next generation science standards. The evolution of science standards over the last 10 years has really been quite interesting in terms of how we've moved from fact-based standards, really pure knowledge-based standards, to performance-based expectations as a nation. And the next generation science standards absolutely represent that. So KnowAtom is located just north of Boston, so we are located in Salem, Massachusetts, about 20 miles north. And we really love the new next generation science standards because when you think about the reason that children learn science and engineering in school, it's not to make every child a scientist or an engineer. That would be foolish because we need more people in society in addition to just scientists and engineers. But we do need scientifically literate citizens as neighbors and considering all of the decisions we have to make together, but also personally on an everyday basis. And so when you think about those higher order thinking skills, the best way to really teach those in a technical sense is through science, technology, engineering, and math, by putting children in the role of scientist and engineer on an everyday basis. And so KnowAtom's sort of day-to-day work is equipping schools and districts particularly, so we don't work as much with teachers specifically, but equipping schools and districts to align to the next generation science standards and be able to provide a next generation inquiry experience that's well supported in terms of teaching and learning. So hopefully that gives you a little flavor of who we are and what we do. But today's discussion is going to be talking primarily about the next generation science standards and how they are a departure from what's the norm nationally, as well as how teachers are taught to teach science traditionally. And a lot of that has been changing as well over the last 5 years or so. But we'll talk a bit about that. Just a note, this particular webinar is going to be looking at sort of a high level of all of these different pieces because, as you can imagine, and hopefully you're aware, that the next generation science standards are not a national set of standards. They are not national curriculum or anything like that. They are the result of a multi-state collaboration as well as a collaboration with the national academies, National Institute of Health, National Research Council, and others to raise the bar on science standards and align science instruction and state-level standards to what is necessary to engage in developing and using the discipline of science and engineering. So when you think about that, it's the option of the states whether or not they adopt these standards. Furthermore, as states have been adopting the standards, it's important to realize that many states have adopted the standards as they were published. Other states have done what's called an adaptation in their adoption. Some of those states have called the next generation science standards their adaptation of the next generation science standards, but they aren't in some cases. In other cases, the adaptation has just been renamed as the state's own standards. So I'll give you a couple examples. So places like Nevada have renamed their state, the next generation science standards as the Nevada Science Standards, yet they are identical. And so what is happening in Nevada is literally next generation science standards. Other states, like West Virginia, have taken the next generation science standards apart and tried to create standards which are based on all of the little elements of each dimension, and sort of divorced the performance expectation from the elements of the dimensions. And so they really do not represent the next generation science standards as an implementation the way that the next generation science standards were intended to be adopted. However, they still call them the same thing. Other states, like Massachusetts, have tried to reword the standards in such a way, building, and what they believe they've done is build some of the foundations of the 3 dimensions into the performance expectation, so now that it represents a standard. You know, so and that's a subject of debate as to whether that has effectively happened. But what I'd like to let you know is, if you are from a state that is adaptation, is an adoptive state in any form, we have state-specific webinars which are similar but different to what we'll be discussing today, because they are more targeted towards the actual implementation approaches of that state, as well as the kind of nuances between current state testing and the likely future of state testing. If you're from a state that is adopting next generation science standards more or less carte blanche, then what you'll learn today is more or less a direct fit without that local flavor. But nonetheless, so feel free to reach out at the end of the webinar, or you can reach out to Mary Ellen DeLacy, respond to you know, her invitation to the webinar, and she'll be able to get you a link to one of those state specifics. There's over 30 state-specific webinars in our database at this point. So nonetheless, our focus today is to really take a look at what makes the next generation science standards tougher, how those standards link to Common Core, ELA, and math, how the implementation, really the adoption, and therefore the implementation of the next generation science standards impact pedagogy around K-12 science instruction, and how these standards are teaching skills at a higher level, which are also integrating not only with ELA and math, but the arts. If you are on the live session, feel free to drop questions into the question box that's on your screen. I'll do my best to integrate those throughout the webinar, and if I do have time at the end, I will try to answer any unanswered questions at the end. So jumping right in here, and again, we'll be painting with some broader brushes because we have folks from all over the country and around the world. The next generation science standards, one of the key innovations and the point at which the next generation science standards kind of emanates from is the nature of science and engineering itself. We now have a firm definition and description and relationship from a standards perspective of what the nature of science and engineering is. So scientists, according to the sort of definition and descriptions, scientists ask questions and answer those questions by forming hypotheses which they test through developing and carrying out experiments. The result of those experiments is data which can be used to form an evidence-based conclusion about that hypothesis. And so that is how scientific knowledge is developed. Scientific knowledge is knowledge from experimentation. Engineers use that scientific knowledge to solve problems. So engineers identify problems and they solve those problems by applying their knowledge of science in a solution, which it's basically a proposed solution, which they then test. And the result of that test yields data, which they can then use to inform their understanding of whether, or really their claim, an evidence-based conclusion about whether they would refine or replicate that prototype. If they would replicate it, then that's technology. It solves the problem. If not, then again, it becomes iterative. So engineers produce technology. Technology is anything that solves a problem. And this forms a kind of cycle because technology enables scientists to answer as well as ask new and different questions, growing the body of scientific knowledge, and that growing body of scientific knowledge enables engineers to solve problems in new and different ways. And the role of math at the center of it all here is as a tool to quantify, analyze, evaluate, and communicate not only the tests themselves, but also the data gathered and the specific data that supports a claim. So you hear claim evidence reasoning so many times. Well, claim evidence reasoning is at the very end of a scientific or engineering design process, which is the endpoint of answering a question or solving a problem. So this is very important to be not only aware of, but something your students should be aware of and really should permeate your curriculum and instruction, that students should know what is science and what is engineering, and particularly when they are in that role, and be able to differentiate between the two and understand how these interact. A major stress point in the transition from current or previous standards to the next generation science standards is leaving behind a traditional model of science instruction. Unfortunately, schools of education nationally and to this day are still plagued by the idea that that teachers are the content experts in the classroom, and that content should flow through that teacher who models the facts and demonstrates phenomena and explains what things are. And perhaps there's some kind of little culminating activity where students then go and follow a procedure or follow a diagram to model for themselves or demonstrate for themselves what was in the book or what was explained or what was demonstrated again. But those are all incredibly lower order thinking skills and a very lower order thinking focus. And the problem with this is not only that it's lower order thinking, but it forces students, it forces children into the role of having to be a sponge in the sense of remembering. So it forces them into a recall, repeat, summarizing mode. And so what happens is that proficiency basically becomes defined by recall and regurgitating information, not about thinking, not about developing and using content, not about the development and practice of skills, but instead about the recall and mapping of facts from a situation that was told to basically a fill in the blank of that same situation later on. And so what you'll see is as there's a transition from this traditional model in classrooms, in some classrooms, to a next generation model that changing the relationship between content and teachers and students is a struggle, not only at a district level, but at an individual sort of pedagogical professional level for educators. And so, I want to also highlight here that it's not just the fact that a traditional model is a teacher handing out facts and being sort of a lecturer. You can replace teacher with a video, textbook, any type of resource like that. And basically, if there is a sort of static model of delivery, and it can be an interactive textbook, okay, something that can be clicked on. The bottom line is that a next generation model functions very differently. It's not content flowing through a book or flowing through a video or pictures or whatever. What it is students developing skills and using those skills to develop and use the content itself, and thereby observing and connecting the phenomenon with the content and being able to relate different aspects of content to each other through its systems behavior. And that's where these next generation science standards really come to life, because they're three-dimensional. And as you see in this diagram, the student is internalizing the practices dimension, the science and engineering practices, and they're using those practices to develop the disciplinary core ideas and the cross-cutting concepts. That's how they are challenged to develop proficiency, and particularly an ability to demonstrate the expectations. So we think about things like evidence statements. Well, this is where children develop the skills to be able to show evidence of their learning and perform the expectations. And so the role of the teacher in this environment is not as the expert sage on the stage, but instead as a coach and a really skillful questioner, and somebody who, through questioning, can really sort of pull the classroom forward in such a way that it appears that the students are pushing, because thoughtful articulation of content, scaffolding from one unit, one lesson to the next over the course of a year, and also from one year to the next, makes that possible. So the new standards in a next generation inquiry environment are not something where you can, some states have there are grade level specific standards, but some states have some nuances on that. The reality is that, and when you look at peak alignment, PEEC, and also EQUIP rubrics for science, it's important to realize that standards are not taught in isolation. They're actually pooled. So it's not a situation of having a grade 5 standard, which is only taught in grade 5, and you teach the grade 5 standards, and then, that's it. Robust curriculum and a robust next generation inquiry environment is pooled standards, so that in any particular lesson and unit, multiple standards are interacting with each other. And so you can picture a next generation inquiry environment here as being a rich content context where students are using multiple skills in order to solve problems and answer questions. And so a teacher is not only a coach, but that coach's role in skillfully questioning and so on is also gradually adjusting the supports for that student so that they can reach a full release of responsibility in a relatively quick timeline, and specifically within the first 10 weeks of school. Another aspect is helping the children understand how to engage appropriately. When you go from a traditional to a next generation instructional environment like this, you have to remember that from a user experience for those children, they're going from an environment where the expectation of them is to listen and remember and then repeat. And in this type of environment, there's, of course, listening and remembering is always a useful skill, but it's not sufficient, because when you solve a problem or answer a question, you're extending what is known into what is unknown. Nobody has shown you how to solve that problem. So you have to use your skills and develop and use the content in order to do that as a student. So that's a very different expectation. There's nothing to put in a blank. The blank is somewhat unknown. And so that's part of learning how to engage appropriately on behalf of the student. Another piece has to do with redirecting and monitoring. So when we talk about full release of responsibility, what we're talking about here is thinking about solving problems and answering questions authentically, students actually engaging in that. So they're planning investigations, then they're carrying out those plans, gathering their data, forming evidence-based conclusions, and you're debriefing as a class to compare and discuss different approaches and outcomes. All of that is intended to build purpose along the way, and redirecting and monitoring has a purpose. When you release responsibility, it's not without accountability, and that's key. You're not letting children go for an hour with no accountability and then just sort of evaluating or discussing the products of that hour. There are intentional milestones along the way so that as students are progressing logically, they're presenting their logic to you, and you're using, again, that artful questioning to help create a culture of critique where students are being challenged. So in this model, proficiency is very different. It's not about remembering. It's about developing using the content. It's about students using their skills to solve problems and answer questions. And it's about them being able to use the system's behavior to not only understand the content, but describe its dynamic interactions. And that's why you see the standards rendered this way. This is one of the big issues in places like Massachusetts and West Virginia, and one of the reasons why the creators achieve the developers of the next generation science standards. And I don't want to say achieve, develop the science standards. It was a collaborative process. 26 states were involved. But when you look at the statements and the cautions that have been made, even publicly, and in particular in places like West Virginia, altering the structure of the standards, rewording them, re-rendering them, actually is a kind of Pandora's box, because it obscures things, elements that are very intentionally engineered to assist not only in curriculum development, but at a classroom level in understanding how the standards are intended to be delivered. So here's how that kind of comes together. So what you see at the top is the performance expectation, and you have these 3 foundation boxes. Now each foundation is a different dimension of the standards. On the left you have the practices, which is the skills dimension. In the center you have the disciplinary core ideas, which is the content dimension. And on the right you have the systems dimension or phenomena dimension, which is cross-cutting concepts. So in order, as a result of instruction, students are going to be able to or going to be expected at a 5th grade level here in this life science standard to demonstrate that they can develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. In order to do that, at a minimum, they need these skills. They need to be able to develop and use this content, and to be able to connect this content with the systems that are observable in that context. So when you think about it, these 3 foundation boxes, that's your classroom environment. That's the job of curriculum, is to create the opportunity in the classroom for students to engage in the practices, to develop and use the content, observe and connect that system behavior, so that they are able to have an opportunity or are challenged to perform or experience performing that expectation in a context. And when you look at this particular one is dealing with ecosystems. The old traditional model is explaining all about ecosystems and then showing students as many ecosystems and parts of ecosystems that you consider relevant to, a grade 5 student, and then hoping on the assessment that the students will be able to recall that and apply it to what is being asked of them. Under the Next Generation Science Standards, the reality is that, and it's already a limit under the existing testing in most states, the limit of this is that you can't, through direct instruction, tell students everything about every plant and every animal that exists on Earth in every ecosystem and every nuanced connection. What you can do is you can develop a skill set in that student so that they have the tools to analyze relationships, so that they can understand the relationships that exist in ecosystems, so that whether they're shown a marine ecosystem or a desert or whatever, with plants and animals that they've seen or not seen, they can extend the knowledge that they do have into this unfamiliar situation, and then actually come to a conclusion of their own, which is not only a claim, but evidence and reasoning for that conclusion. And I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. And bringing back traditional model of instruction again, another problem with that traditional model of instruction is that it limits and pretty much removes students' opportunity to develop the skills specific to science and engineering, those practices. And at a high level in the Next Generation Science Standards, these are the 8 practices that exist. They become a little more granular, sort of unpacked within specific performance expectations, but fully packed, this is the 8. So from a student's perspective, they need to be able to ask questions, define problems, develop models, plan investigations, analyze data, construct explanations, design solutions, argue from evidence, in addition to carrying out the investigations and using the models and so on, which planning, developing, analyzing, these are much higher level thinking. There's much higher level thinking required versus carrying out or using what's shown or given. And so what's shown or given is the more traditional model, let's read about everything and then carry out a culminating activity, or have an activity and try to use that to excite the kids and then tell them all about something. this is that higher order thinking, the creating, evaluating, analyzing, happening simultaneously. So when you think about Bloom's taxonomy, really, Bloom's taxonomy is the 6-layer pyramid where you go from lowest order, which is remembering, understanding, applying, to highest order, analyzing, evaluating, creating. However, these next generation science standards really require higher order thinking skills, creating, evaluating, analyzing, to happen simultaneously. And that's really key to recognize. These are not things that can be isolated. And unfortunately, a lot of, and this is something you'll see from state leaders, and depending on what state you're from, some state leaders struggle, I think, with understanding the standards themselves, and it's obvious in the kind of recommendations they make and the way that the standards have been rendered and even adopted in these states, some of them. But what's the challenge here is that there are some states that are kind of going around and saying that part of their implementation plan is that people should try to incorporate the practices of science and engineering into their existing curriculum. Now, I guess the emphasis here is try, because the reality is if your curriculum that you've created and have in place mirrors that next generation inquiry model that we were talking about earlier, where essentially the students are in the role of scientist and engineer, that they have developed skills which they can independently apply to novel content contexts and develop plans using those skills, and then carry out the plans, gather data, and form evidence-based conclusions, then you already have the STEM practices in your curriculum. Now, there may be some tweaks to it, but the practices will have a home in your curriculum. If your curriculum consists of worksheets and videos and textbooks where whether it's a human or a non-human essentially explaining or projecting information at children, then there's really no home to be able to plan an investigation, or to be able to develop a model, or to be able to argue from evidence, because these STEM practices are all intermingled. They have an interdependence. So you can see this when you look down this list, because it's very hard to argue from evidence unless you can obtain, evaluate, and communicate it. And when you're arguing from evidence, you're actually constructing an explanation, or you are supporting an actual solution that's been designed. In order to have any evidence to support that argument, you have to have been able to interpret and analyze data, which is the result of having planned and carried out an investigation. So you can see each of these is sort of dependent on the other, which is getting at, which is, I think, probably the weakness. If there's an Achilles heel in the next generation science standards, it's related to process, because process is referred to, but it's really not broken out well. And over the last 10 years, the way that NOADM was able to become next generation aligned so quickly is that we were not only following the whole next generation development process and integrating a lot of the recommendations from the early reports in terms of what effective science instruction looks like, but furthermore, when the drafts were coming out, the recommendations and alignment of the different dimensions to performance expectations over time were things that we were developing into our curriculum purely because, for two key reasons. One is that it's great teaching and learning. Secondly, it was producing great data outcomes, and I'll show you some of those later, in standardized testing. So we knew that we were not only equipping students to really think at a high level and to be able to work with content, develop, and use it, but in fact it was a more effective way of teaching and learning because we were able to see, even on assessments that were not aligned, major data gains. Now, along that way, the process aspect of science and engineering is one that we spent a lot of time working on, because the reality is the practices are just tools to be able to engage in science and engineering. These are tools like writing practices, word choice, voice, sentence structure, as an example in the case of writing. Those are the tools to engage in writing. Those 8 practices I showed you earlier, those are the tools to engage in science and engineering. Well, if you're going to be a professional writer, you can't write best-selling books the way that you write an email. Just jot it down and send it off to the publisher. What you have to do is engage in a writing process, a logical way of going from an idea to a high-quality published work. So in the case of writing, that looks like pre-writing or brainstorming, pre-writing, drafting, editing, revising, and then publishing. So a logical process that requires all of the writing practices. In the case of science and engineering, we have those 8 writing practices that we talked about earlier, but there is also scientific process and engineering design process. Now the point that I want to make here is that there is a nuance on a statement by the National Research Council, which is sort of commentary on the fact that science and engineering are not prescribed. And what that means is that science and engineering are acting in the unknown. They are extending what is known into what is unknown. And by nature of extending, into the unknown, you cannot prescribe what is not known. However, there is process, there is a value to logic, and when you look at the scientific process, which we've refined and have used with first grade through 8th grade students for years now, as well as the engineering design process, what you are seeing here is logic to go from a question to an evidence-based conclusion, or from a problem to an evidence-based conclusion, which is a kind of single step. So science and engineering is nonlinear because when you make that single step, what you have learned then causes you to pivot. The result of what you've learned is informing your approach and your next step, which is a pivot, most likely, because it's very rare that the result of one experiment really answers any question. But what we discover causes us to either change our hypothesis, our procedure, or our question entirely and move in a new direction or a new approach. The same is true of engineering. You have a single step, and then you learn from it, and then you revise or replicate. It's rare that you replicate. It's more often the case that you attempt a new solution or you revise the solution attempt that you made in the first place. So I want to bring this out because this is how high-quality science and engineering takes place. It takes place, it's a logical pursuit of answers to questions and solutions to problems. And so just the way that we step forward in a straight line in any single step, we constantly are pivoting. So the reality is that any one of us walks not in straight lines, but in curved and nonlinear patterns or non-patterns. So that's a lot to be said about that, but it's important because it's one of the places where the standards, the new next generation science standards, are weakest at explaining, and state models for science and engineering process are most oftentimes really lacking in terms of a student's grade level appropriateness, and also helping students to understand the kind of the logic, in essence, of how do I go from a problem or a question towards an evidence-based conclusion. So backing that up, though, in a classroom, one way that can manifest itself, and this is a model we use and have developed over the course of the last 10 years, is that the role is to use nonfiction reading to lay content foundation. However, that it's less than 20% of the time on learning allocated to a lesson. That the role of nonfiction reading is not that it's a literacy approach to mastery of standards, because again, these standards are not something you can achieve mastery of with literacy alone. The goal is to anchor concepts in reality, and that's what nonfiction reading can do. And that lays a foundation for Socratic dialogue, or that artful questioning we were talking about earlier. Not lecture, but actually asking students higher order questions which require them to have to create, evaluate, or analyze with the context of the content, and offer that to the class, but also be making, as part of this, concept to concept, concept to self, and concept to world connections with the disciplinary core ideas themselves, and that sets the stage. So again, so we have purpose. The reading has its purpose, the dialogue has its purpose, and that sets the stage for a problem or question which students can break into teams. And so if you think about problem-based learning, active learning, that's what we're talking about here, that 21st century skill of collaborating, come alive through a problem or question, which students can then use the scientific or engineering design process to plan an investigation and test it, actually carry out that investigation, gather the data, and then form an evidence-based conclusion. And what's nice about that, and thinking again about full release responsibility, those students are bringing their own ideas to life, and by virtue of doing that, you'll have diversity within the classroom of many different approaches, many different ideas, which provide a rich context for more Socratic dialogue as student teams share out and debrief and compare in a culture of critique in that classroom their approach to a particular problem or question. So this is very effective, and when you think about a lesson under Next Generation Science Standards, you shouldn't think about a 45-minute time period. You should think of a series of class periods that that are an experience in and of them, form an experience where multiple standards are coming to life, prior grade level standards are being reinforced, grade level specific standards are being mastered, and future grade level standards are being introduced. That is a that's sort of at a high level, well-articulated curriculum, but specifically student experience with these standards. And so the reason I give you that sort of picture is there is a new, under Next Generation Science Standards, they're influenced by this new definition of effective STEM instruction, which comes from one of the partner organizations early in the process, the National Research Council. And their definition is that effective science instruction capitalizes on students' early interests and experiences. So if you're from a state that has grade level spans, and most states are either testing in grade 4 or grade 5, and then again in grade 8, and then either grade 10 or grade 12. Grade span standards, oftentimes the resulting curriculum and approach fails to capitalize on students' early interests and experiences because, unfortunately, the focus of instruction tends to be in years when there is a focus on testing. So it's unfortunate that oftentimes second grade is not supporting third grade and third grade is not supporting fourth grade, but if there's fifth grade testing or fourth grade testing, that's when science really happens, and unfortunately then it defaults over to down, kind of more of that projecting of content, which you'll see here in the next section. Identifying and building on what students know. It's very hard to do that if it's all happening, if 4 years or 5 years of instruction happen in 1 year through projecting. And then particularly, identifying and building on what students know means it's an intentional nurturing process, not only from September through June, but from one grade level to the next. The final piece of this definition is providing students with the experiences to engage in the practices of science. The word practices is deliberate here. Practices are skills, the 8 that we were talking about earlier. So providing students with the experience, or I would probably even change this as the sort of challenging students or compelling students, requiring students to engage in the practices of science and sustain their interest this way. And what that means is creating an experience where students are applying their skills, developing on what they know, building on it, and thereby bringing their ideas to life. And that's part of sustaining student interest. And rigor, I think folks get really confused about what rigor really is. Rigor is not a lot of vocab words. Rigor is not a lot of worksheets. It's not a lot of talking or this. Rigor is a lot of thinking, and it's not the teacher, it's the student. And so rigorous curriculum forces students to think. It doesn't allow students to remain in sort of that lower order thinking mode, just recalling, just, what you see on the left here is exactly that in this picture. You see a teacher pre-teaching or modeling all the students who are trying to, remember exactly what they've seen and how they've seen it happen, and then they're going to break up, go all over to their own raised beds and do exactly what this teacher did. So all they're doing is repeating a demonstration for themselves. There's no engagement in the practices. Okay, they're not developing models, they're not planning investigations, there's none of that. They're just being put into a situation where they're going to absorb something and then mirror it back. On the right, these two students are fifth grade students, and they are in that role of engineer. They've gone through that kind of arc, nonfiction reading, Socratic dialogue with the class, and now they're taking a problem apart. They're trying to solve it. They don't know how that problem gets solved. They have some resources available. They have knowledge of the process, the engineering design process, so they're going to try to logically pursue this problem, and they're going to apply the skills that they've developed, solving other problems and answering other questions. So what's happening here is going to be unique to that group on the right. That's what it means to be engaged in the practices of science and engineering, and it sustains their interest because it's their idea. It's much more engaging to make your own ideas come to life than it is to try and make somebody else's, kind of what they've shown you happen again. So part of the way, and let's see, we'll take a look at a few assessments here in a second, but I'll just show you an example of how that comes together in a unit within a classroom. So I'll use a grade 7 example. So you can think of science and these units are pooling multiple standards and different elements of the performance expectations. A first lesson in a middle school level would most likely take a week, kind of going over that arc that I was talking about earlier. And first learning about or extending knowledge of the water cycle, earth systems, groundwater and earth materials, learning about aquifers and how they're depleted and replenished and so on, and the interaction between each of these systems. And then the problem, and in this case here's a model, which you can download an example of this off our site if you want to see in more detail. These are just screenshots of an exemplar for a teacher, but they come to a question of which earth materials are most permeable to groundwater, and so students then need to use their knowledge of the scientific process to progress beyond that. So okay, how do I go about answering this question? I want to take what I know, so that's the research. So what do I know? What are the facts relevant to this question? What's the hypothesis now that I've informed myself with the facts that I know and can gather? What do I think is a possible answer to this question, and then progress into how am I going to test that, gather the necessary data, be able to reflect on it. So that first lesson sets students up with a knowledge of the connection between these systems and how different earth materials perform differently in relation to water penetrating them. But then the next lesson, or sort of the transition to the next lesson, is around the contemporary issues of pollution. Pollution's always been an issue, but we have contemporary issues of pollution, things like non-point source pollution. So students learn about what are the kinds of pollution, where are they found, how do they travel, and so on, and link that to what they learned earlier in the scientific context of water cycle, interactions between the water cycle and earth materials, and also because of the permeability of earth materials, the interaction between surface contaminants and air contaminants with groundwater, and then how that groundwater moves over time and is able to affect wells for plants or for humans and animals and plants far away. And so it takes that science and anchors it again in a purposeful real-life context, and then students are able to take on the role of engineer, thinking about solving the issue of polluted groundwater by removing contaminants and trying to solve the problem of a fictional town needing low-cost water filtration devices. And you can see here it's applying an engineering design process, and students using their knowledge of that process, apply their skills to go from a problem to an evidence-based solution, like you see here. And then each of these pieces is a kind of summative informative assessment. It's summative of the student's understanding in the moment, but then it's also formative because it's showing where the student's skill set is. And that's a skill set that's going to need to be applied over and over and over again in the future lessons and units. So that helps inform instruction for teachers, but also if your curriculum is well articulated and it is truly scaffolding September through June and from one grade level to the next, it also informs instruction of the very next lesson because the concepts are building over time. So any focus correction areas can be addressed in the very next lesson. As you can imagine, if you see something in the context of the scientific investigation about earth and water cycle and ground the permeability of water through ground materials, earth materials. That's something you could talk about as part of your discussion and reinforce and redirect in your discussion around pollution, right? Because all of those same ideas come up again, and then again you can reinforce and have that discussion within the context of solving that problem as well. So there's multiple points to differentiate, reinforce, redirect. And the nature of this kind of classroom assessments that need to be created and the kind that we've created around this need to mirror the kind of assessments that we see at a state level. And I'll show you what those look like in a moment for next generation science standards. DC being the first in the nation to have a operational next generation science assessment. Illinois is a close second, I think, by a few days, and others are in hot pursuit as well. But you have to realize that direct instruction has limited value, if not no value, in this environment, because what we're talking about is not something to be remembered as it's told, but something to be known to a degree. It can be applied and developed and used. And so what you see here is a scenario-based assessment that's a concept assessment that's part of one of our units that actually may be the unit I just showed you. And what you see here is a scenario that's going to be related to content that students would have learned in the unit, but not the result of direct instruction, so that students have to generalize what they've learned, use their skills, and then apply that to this context and be able to answer a series of questions that tease out the different elements of the next generation science standards that relate to that unit. Now, the way that that relates to next generation science assessments, I'm going to use a DC example here for you, because DC has been loaning out their items to other states. That's how Illinois pretty much was able to flip a switch when the federal government came and said, we understand that your testing is not aligned, and I guess maybe this is a sidebar nuance. So because of No Child Left Behind requirements for state testing and sort of the connection between testing and federal money, many states then also applied for waivers, and part of that waiver language and requirement was approval of a waiver based on all the different testing that happens in the state. And so the federal requirement is that science testing happens within grades 3 to 5 at least once, between grades 6 through 8 at least once, and at a high school level at least once. And so in places like Illinois, what they've done is they said, well, DC has already vetted all the items. They have an operational assessment aligned to the next generation science standards. So what we're going to do is literally just take those questions and make it operational. We don't need to go through sort of a vetting process because we know it's been vetted. We have the same standards. You know, the water in Illinois is no different. And so, you know, we can go operational now. So that's what many states are in the process of doing. Illinois took probably the most aggressive switch. Others are, pretty much every other state is within a 3-year operational timeline. Few exceptions, but more or less that's what it looks like. So DC, their assessment is computer-based, and it has both open response as well as multiple choice items and something called a technology enhanced item. And I'll show you what these look like. And if you have computer-based science testing now, chances are you're already familiar with that construct. But the testing, and we see this with most states, that the testing is testing the grade span. So it's testing all of the standards prior, not just the grade level in which the testing takes place. So this is a 5th grade test. It's testing all the standards prior. And what's important to realize about that is that, again, back to my example of if you try to teach grade level specific standards only in that grade level, then you have developed systemic gaps in your district and curriculum as a result, and they'll be detectable on the testing. And the reason for that is the testing tests all those standards, but furthermore, think about these systemic gaps where they're emanating from. They're emanating from students who have go on vacations instead of coming to school, who have extended periods of illness. They come from students who are transient in district or who are new to district. And as a result of that, if you only teach a standard in one grade level, then that student is not getting a second chance. And that that maybe not getting a first chance if they happen to appear in the year in which testing occurs. Let's look at the test items. So this is an example of a constructed response, or what other people might call an open response. There's the scenario. So there's a couple fictional students. They're engaged as scientists. They have a hypothesis. They've developed an experiment. They carry out that. They have developed a scientific diagram. They carry out the experiment according to what you see here in the scientific diagram, and they have gathered data. But they each come, these fictional students each come to a different conclusion. And unfortunately, they're flawed. They did not support their conclusions with analysis of the evidence provided, specific data. And so the student who's being tested, the real student, is being asked whose claim is correct and to explain why that claim is correct and to use evidence to support that claim. So here's that claim evidence reasoning. Okay, so the student who's being tested needs to take those practices, their knowledge of the scientific process, and analyze the situation to construct their own claim, support it with their own evidence, that's the results of analysis here of these data tables, and reason it in writing. That is much higher level than what the typical open response looks like in really in every state. The exception, I would say, that we've seen is the New England Common Assessment Program. The New England Common Assessment Program is used by several states, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, in the New England area. It's produced by Measured Progress. And it is probably the only assessment that is really well aligned to this model under the previous standards. But nonetheless, this is a next generation aligned assessment, and you can see this is where it's going. Now those fictional students continue in a couple other items. That's another kind of common theme to these next generation type assessments. In this case, because it's computer based, these different images of organisms, a student's going to need to drag and drop those into their proper place in the food chain or food web. Now you can imagine somebody who is in a traditional mode is like, wow, now I have to show every student every animal and every plant on Earth and what they eat and who eats them and all that sort of stuff. Well, that's impossible. So the goal here is that, again, a student is going to be able to develop a model to describe the movement of energy through this food web and be able to connect that to the basic categories of plants and animals and insects and so on that exist in a food chain or food web. And so basically being able to categorize these things by their properties, it's much more higher order thinking. The other piece of it is that there's then a constructed response that adds on to that, which you can see very slightly down the bottom there, where a student is going to be asked to explain the shortest path for energy to get from the plants to the fox. On the right, you can see an example of a multiple choice. Now, this is the next generation of multiple choices because you not only have a model, which a student has to use to come up with their answer, but in fact there are 3 correct out of 6 possible answers, and the student needs to select all 3. Just like in the previous item, there is a constructed response item, an open response item, where the student needs to then look at the model and extend it further. So use their skills and understanding of the content to extend further to talk about how matter is cycled back into the environment. So they have to look at something like a minnow and say, a minnow has a life cycle. If a minnow dies, then it's also part of a food chain that involves the bacteria, because the bacteria are decomposers. So as part of kind of a food chain, the bacteria is going to consume the dead minnow, decomposing it, and then making that matter available to the environment again, and the algae will be able to take that up as nutrients, or so on. So you can see that that item requires a lot of higher order thinking, but particularly applying those practices and the knowledge of the content to actually develop and use what's in this model and connect it to other areas of content. And I'm not going to go into more of these now, except to just say you can see all of the items look like this. There are no identify which of the following is an igneous rock type items, okay? Those are the kind of items that existed under previous standards and are the kind of items that don't really, what's meaningful about that really, unless a student is, of the 4% of students who go on to be scientists or engineers at the end of the day, a very few of those go on to be geologists or any particular specialty. So again, the value of being able to identify just in general sedimentary, igneous, or metamorphic rock under, like you would see under the old standards, is relatively of no use. So one of the things I want to show you here is misinformation. So one of the things that has started to happen a bit, as you might expect, is that folks who are ill-informed on many sides are starting to kind of rail a bit on the next generation science standards. And one example of that is from this blogger in Missouri who put up this image of a worksheet from a California classroom, and they said a parent from California in the Sweetwater School District is unimpressed with what his child is learning via the next generation science standards, and they gave this worksheet from his 8th grade class as an example. Now, I hope that you can look at this and right away understand, as a result of our last hour together here, that this worksheet has nothing to do with next generation science standards. You have to realize that there's a difference between standards and curriculum. We have an hour-long discussion about that. It's available on demand. It's free. Go under our website. I believe there's even a blog post about it if you want to read. There might even be an ebook. It's really important to understand that standards are not curriculum. Standards are just a minimum expectation of performance on behalf of that student. Curriculum's job is to bring students to a level of mastery and do so by creating those experiences, nurture their understanding, engage them in the practices, and help them develop a framework of understanding of the content. What you see here does none of that. When you think about the next generation science standards, there are a few ways to know that this is not aligned. First and foremost, it's a video. It's based on a video. Like I said, the traditional model is to project information at children. So a video was used to do that. Secondly, there are no practices here. The student does not need to engage in any of those 8 science and engineering practices in order to fill in the blanks. Secondly, what's here is just rote facts. It is not dynamic content like you see under the disciplinary core ideas, and it does not require the student to connect the content with phenomena, which would be the cross-cutting concepts dimension. And this sheet in its entirety does not represent a performance expectation, but purely recall. So nothing about this sheet is next generation science aligned, period. And so, so a parent not understanding really what the next generation science standards are about, not understanding what alignment is about, sort of, I guess, ran with this. And perhaps it may reflect also that there's an educator who does not understand what alignment is about. Now, California, if you know, if you're from California or you know much about California at this point, California is presently approaching implementation requirements. So right now there's a bit of a gray area where prudent districts are integrating and implementing next generation science standards to in curriculum that's aligned to them in order to make use of the little window here between the present testing and the future testing, which looks like what I showed you earlier. Those who are less prudent and are reactionary and unfortunately perhaps maybe putting themselves in more of a victim's position here of having to react to change, have not adopted or adapted and are not implementing anything that's next generation aligned. And so those kind of schools and districts are engaging or continuing to use resources like what you see here. And so a piece about that that's important to realize, and I'm going to wrap up here, and I'll mention a little bit about the art connection as well here in 1 second before I wrap up. If you have any questions, feel free to drop those in now. I know we are bumping up against time constraints, so I'll do my best to answer at least a couple if I can, and then I'll take the rest offline. So there are different resource levels for different readiness levels. And so what we need under the next generation science standards is mastery readiness. We need children, and I'll kind of work our way down here. So mastery readiness is what we were looking at those next generation science assessments. It's students with skills who are able to take whatever knowledge they have and extend it into an unknown, unfamiliar situation and actually emerge with not only an opinion, but a claim which they can support with evidence and reason logically and in a compelling manner using the evidence available. Now, you can think about that as somebody planning a commercial kitchen, and they have to have durable surfaces, countertops and whatever, and they have certain constraints and they have certain available materials. A student who is mastery ready will be able to take their knowledge and skills, and although they've never designed any kitchens or anything like this, be able to look at the properties of available materials, look at the constraints, look at the needs of the environment, and actually take what they know about things like earth materials and organic versus inorganic and synthetics and so on, and be able to kind of look at those properties and balance the properties of the materials, the available kind of solutions, with the criteria and form an evidence-based conclusion about which material is best suited for that commercial countertop. Performance-ready resources are below that. What those are typically the kind of kits that people do 3 or 4 a year. They read all about something and then do a culminating activity. So learn all about rocks and minerals, and then here's a procedure or a diagram of how to, in a worksheet, take the rocks and scratch them on the surfaces, carry out a scratch test to find out their different hardness levels, and eliminate the ones until you figure out which one is granite versus talc or something like this. Knowledge-ready resources are even below that. That's like textbooks, and that's true whether they're electronic, whether they are paper-based, whether you tattoo them on your arm. Knowledge-ready resources are kind of backward-looking. They are more historical resources. They develop knowledge of what scientists and engineers have done. They explain a concept. They make you knowledgeable but not really skillful. Awareness-ready resources are what is, again, there's a plethora of textbooks. There's even more of these awareness resources where it's the kind of free download stuff, 1-2 page lesson plan. There's a lot of sort of these platforms where there are kind of lessons for teachers by teachers that are very brief, kind of designed to raise a student's awareness around what a engineer is. And so as a result of engaging in an activity or a discussion, students will be able to kind of raise their hand and tell you engineers solve problems. Doesn't mean they know all about what engineers have done. They're not ready to really engage in experimenting, any kind of skill level development of that knowledge. And so those awareness resources are at the bottom. So when you look at the things that even claim to be next generation aligned, this is kind of the spectrum of what they fall into and things to keep in mind. And I'm obviously partial to what we do. I think we have one of the few, if not only, really well articulated mastery ready resources out there. There must be one other one out there, and I'm sure in individual classrooms where teachers have obviously dedicated their lives to developing things at a very high level, that there's, I'm sure, examples, but nonetheless, it is what it is. Things to think about. So I mentioned about art and the connection between what's being taught under the next generation science standards, these skills, this culture of critique, 21st century skills around communication and such. It's important to realize that artists are trained formally or informally in a culture of critique, and that art, and this is important, something you should realize, and it's worth a team discussion. Art is engineered communication. Unfortunately, in K-12, people think that art, oftentimes, this is the definition that we hear, art is about making things pretty or beautiful, kind of the aesthetics of things. Well, think about this. artists in the wrong place and at the wrong time often go to jail. They get persecuted. Why is that? Is it because they make things pretty, or is it because they're communicating controversial and unpopular ideas at times and in places where that's not allowed? And so when you think about it that way, it's important to realize that what artists are doing is they're communicating through a medium, whether it's paint, whether it is sculpture, whether it is music or dance or whatever. And as an example, I wanted to show you Pablo Picasso's Guernica because he's a great example. He was an artist living in exile, and well, he was in France in exile, and someone came to him and he was asked to do a piece for an international art exhibition, and he created this piece, Guernica, named after a village where the fascists had committed great atrocities in his home country of Spain. And you can see there's nothing about this that's pretty. It has a particular style that's identifiable as Pablo Picasso's style, but nonetheless, this isn't a pretty piece. And in fact, it's showing destruction and chaos and pain and how these atrocities are affecting both people and animals and life in this village. And so he created this and he sent it off to this international art exhibition as a statement to the world to take notice of what was happening, and also to the fascists in terms of what they're doing is not going unnoticed either. And that was an intentional piece of communication. And it was effective because, as evidence, the fascists came back to him after the fact and said, "Hey, what did you do here?" And as the story goes, his response was, "I didn't do it, but you did." And so you can see that you know, he was intentionally making a statement about these atrocities. And the connection to science and engineering and the skills that we're teaching is that we're teaching children to be able to communicate and think about communication, receive communication more critically, to create, evaluate, and analyze. And those are the skills necessary to be an artist. They're the skills necessary to create art, but also consume art and to communicate well. And so when you think about this in a K-12 context, this is a great opportunity to transform what and how art is taught, potentially, and the kind of collaboration that happens between the skills taught in STEM, or science and engineering, as well as art. And to take the definition beyond making the things that art, you know, and not making pretty things, but making things that are purposeful and meaningful and to specific groups or people. So I'll leave that there. I'm going to show you the data and then be happy to take a couple questions. So think about the curriculum professional development materials as supporting that STEM learning environment and supporting educators in creating a next generation inquiry environment that places the children in the role of scientist and engineer and really nurturing that over time and from one grade level to the next. So you can imagine having these pieces fit hand in glove is always an advantage. I mentioned about data. So I'll use a couple examples from Massachusetts. So even under existing testing, which is not currently aligned to next generation science standards, and I mentioned how we were able to become aligned so quickly, we've been working on this and implementing this for years just because we were getting data gains, so why not? You can see here, suburban schools, such as this example, the state average is 50% for advanced and proficient, and you can see this example going from average to 20 some odd points above average just over the course of a year, the first bit of implementation, and sustaining that over time. The reason it's hard to get above 80 in Massachusetts in particular is that when you have a high volume of students, what happens is the open response items are heavily weighted, and so if a student, there's only 4 potential points. If a student doesn't get every one of those points, it makes it hard to get above 80. But however, what's interesting is even in urban environments like this one, we see districts still getting above 80, and I can show you other examples where they're into the 90s. In the case of Massachusetts, we have, I believe, 3 out of the top 5 schools and districts in the state are teaching and learning you know, through this program and such. And so what you see here is an urban elementary school where the 35% ELL, 72% low income, 65% free lunch, 75% high needs, and again you've got that 50% state average. And look at, they go from well below to well above the state average, again in a single year, and then they, over the course of 2.5 years, add 51 points to their advanced and proficient to become something like 87% advanced and proficient. Now, why do they have these mean reversion? There's a positive trend still, but they have these dips. Well, teachers and administrators still matter, because without them, the learning outcomes are dramatically impacted. You need that skillful coach, and that has to do with professional development. It has to do with all kinds of factors. Nonetheless, what's interesting is that the student body does not fall back to square one or below, because the development of knowledge and that exposure over time, as well as the skill set and the logic of these processes, help students defend for themselves. And so what you see here are students still able to perform the expectations of the testing even under adverse circumstances. And I'll show you an even more challenged environment. One of the lowest, it was like bottom 10 in the state, middle schools. And you can see 4% proficient, and over the course of 2 years they add 24 points. And they actually now function at the level of what's average, averaged for the urban middle schools in Massachusetts, the middle schools from the 26 largest cities in the state. And this is the most recent test data that I've been showing you. So you'll see that hopefully that trend continues. But what I wanted to point out is the students who are basic, below basic level students, which are considered warning failing here in Massachusetts, is cut in half, virtually cut in half. And so that's another most important point to point out. And you can see the challenging environment that 64% of these students, their first language is not English, 15% are ELLs, 95% are low income, 87% free lunch, and 97% high needs, and yet they're still able to make these leaps and bounds in short periods of time. So with that said, now we have data from New Hampshire as well, and you can see different subgroups and so on. I won't get into all that. We're a bit over time. But I'll let you know that, and I'll grab a couple questions here, that we do have another webinar that really goes from this high level further down into how you actually implement, and then there's also some others beyond that where we're talking about how actual lessons and units are constructed, and you're welcome to take a look at those. If you have any questions around those sort of things, or some of the examples I've been giving, which I used from our own curriculum resources and materials and such, you're welcome to reach out to Mary Ellen DeLacy. And also, if you want to get in touch with me, again, my name's Francis, Francis Vigent. You're welcome to reach out to her, and she'll get that over to me, and I'll do my best to get in touch with you to answer your question. So let's see here. We have a few questions. So let's see. Some folks are asking about recordings of the webinar as well as transcripts and things like this. So the answer to that is yes, those pieces will be available. So generally within 24 hours on the live session, you will get a email from Mary Ellen. She'll follow up with you and send you a link to the recording of this webinar. You can also if you have like state-specific questions, you're welcome to reach out with those, and she'll direct you to a state-specific resource. Those are a little bit trickier to find on our website, but there are a lot of resources available under the resources section. We literally have hundreds of webinars and such. In terms of a transcript, those are typically published, but those are published generally within a month after the webinar's live session. Some folks are asking about reading levels being considered in science testing, and also some issues around controversy with green buildings and sustainability and things like this. So let's take one piece at a time. So are reading levels considered in science testing? Of course they are. But the reality is that there's a great study, cohesion model, establishing a cohesion model of meaning. And one of the individuals on that study is Pearson, not the company, but just somebody by an unfortunate last name. And so what I would say is take a look at that, because there's a lot of misinformation around what it means to have grade level appropriate reading. So testing is leveled, language levels and reading levels and such. And there are also alternative tests which seek to remove reading as a barrier. Again, if a child has a language-based learning disability, if it's documented, then that child has accommodations to remove the requirement to read something such that it's not a barrier to success, right, or a barrier to articulating one's understanding or ability to perform the expectations because of a language-based learning disability. So that said, when you look at science text using something simple like Fry's readability, and you try to assess the readability level of a text, you have to realize that most or many of the reading metrics function off very basic criteria, which have a lot of implied assumptions. So I'll explain this. So the criteria that it often functions off of is the number of syllables in the word and the number of words in a sentence. That's sort of the basic, and then there's some nuances off of that. So what you have to understand is that the vocabulary within science is the vocabulary of science. Matter is matter. It is not cotton candy. It is not, something else. It is matter. And so there are certain situations where the vocabulary that's required has multiple syllables, and that's just how it is. So by the nature of engaging in science at all, you necessarily are pushing the number of syllables of words up. That doesn't mean that students can't understand those words. It just means that there are more syllables. Another piece that's inherently difficult with science is that in order to give a word its proper context and meaning tends to require more words, because science is nuanced. Okay, unlike fictional writing, which may have nuances, but there's sort of a very broad brush or gray area with which those nuances have relevance. Science nuances tend to have relevance, and so to eliminate that nuance, which would make sentences shorter, is not something that is possible. So what I'm trying to explain to you here is that science has a tendency towards more syllables in the words and longer sentences. So science, all of the documentation around grade level appropriate reading in science is that it tends to come in 2 grade levels ahead of what these basic tools for readability expect. Now the thing is that there's also research around that shows that students are able to read at these levels, and it's just the nature of the science text. Now, backing away from that a little bit, there's another piece around these readability matrices, is the actual assumption of the particular metric you're using. So the short sentences and fewer syllables approach is it relies on a student's ability to establish meaning by making connections between sentences. So it assumes that it's easier for a student to make a connection between multiple sentences versus unpacking and having explicit connection within a sentence. And that's where the study title, Establishing a Cohesion Model of Meaning, comes from. Because in order to find cohesive meaning, it either comes from within the sentence and the sentence explicitly connecting the ideas, or a student has to do that on their own by connecting many smaller sentences. And in fact, one of the shocking pieces of that study is that through testing even of college-level students, that having more context within a sentence made it easier and for a student to understand the meaning versus trying to generate that meaning on their own from implied connections across many smaller sentences. So buyer beware when there's, leveled anything, because leveled, there's a big asterisk and a lot of assumptions in terms of what leveling means. From a lexile perspective, the importance of not drilling and killing vocabulary is, and using it in context is that the more often a word is used and the more context it has, and sort of the many different contexts that that word is used in, the lexile level actually drops. So again, it only makes sense, right, that that the more often you use a word and the more sort of different contexts that you see that word in, the easier it is to understand. And that's the key, is that we're reading for understanding here. In terms of controversy around some of the other things folks have brought up, the controversies around climate change and issues of green energy. West Virginia had a major fight over this around the wording of the standards before they would adopt them, because they wanted to be respectful of coal's presence in the community and so on and so forth, and not present information that some people, well, maybe very few, but some people take issue with and such. That's part of change. There was a time when bleeding people was an acceptable practice to solve medical issues, and times have changed and we know better now, and that we're going through one of those types of changes right now. So expect debate, but I would say that the new standards in most states, pretty much every state, exceed what's necessary. And what's really interesting in states like Pennsylvania is that while there are sort of political and financial barriers to a formal adoption at the state level, the next generation science standards they meet and as well as exceed the requirements of the state level testing, that the teachers and districts are going ahead on their own and they're just adopting these standards. Their students are proficient and able to perform on the state testing, so they're not essentially ignoring the state standards, but what they're doing is they're going well beyond it. And I would explain this in sort of the way that public health codes function. Standards are like health codes. The Department of Health is going to require you to clean your coffee maker twice a year if you own a restaurant, but a prudent restaurant probably cleans their coffee pot once a day at least. And so sort of thinking of the idea of cleaning your coffee pot every day as somehow not doing what's being asked of you is kind of a warped logic. And that's perhaps maybe why people go to some restaurants more than others, right? If you clean more than necessary, that may be a desirable characteristic and actually may produce desirable outcomes such that people who only do the minimum don't produce. And that's kind of how I think when Pennsylvania as an example, educators are viewing these standards. They're like, we could do the minimum and kind of function with what we've got, or we can implement and really achieve a higher level, still meet the basic requirements, but really do something great for kids and for teaching and learning. And that's, I think, where this is coming from. And many states and such, Wisconsin's another great example. Wisconsin has basic frameworks which are really well aligned, but they're a very basic version of the next generation science standards. So leading districts, innovators, can teach and produce incredibly high levels of learning with next generation aligned resources and standards, and still meet the requirements of testing and the Wisconsin frameworks as well. So I will leave it there. If you do have other questions, feel free to reach out to Mary Ellen DeLacy, like I said, and forward those questions along. If you would like to take a look at any resources, like I said, there's a month of curriculum and the corresponding students piece reading component, nonfiction reading, available on our site. If you are from Massachusetts, so what's on our site is California and NGSS. If you're from Massachusetts, we do have a Massachusetts-specific version. There's not a link to that on our site, but Mary Ellen will be able to get that to you. And like I said, all the other month's resources are available for purchase. That's how we keep our lights on. But nonetheless, they are available, and Mary Ellen can get you the right person on that as well. Take a look at the case study, looking at some of these schools up close. There's a great urban case study up there now with the most recent data. Subscribe to our blog, stay connected, it's free. We like to put articles out about what's happening around the country, as well as tips and other things around NGSS and emerging news there. Follow us on Facebook. It's facebook.com/noadam. Our Twitter handle is noadam, @noadam. And like I said, you can get a number of ebooks, live and on-demand webinars, even discussions with innovators, district innovators, as well as STEM innovators under noadam.com/resources, or you can just go to the noadam.com site and take a look around at the resource link at the top of your page. Thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it, and I wish you well as you endeavor to make the switch or consider adopting or adapting the next generation science standards in your classroom in whatever state you're teaching in. Have a great afternoon, and I wish you well. Take care. Bye-bye.